It is the autumn of 1940, and Britain is losing the war underground. Above the chalk downs of southern England, the skies are still thick with the roar of Spitfires and Hurricanes locked in daily combat with the Luftwaffe. The Battle of Britain is being won, just barely, in the air, but beneath the surface, beneath the fields and villages and requisitioned country houses, something else entirely is taking shape. Something the Germans have no word for because they have no equivalent. Something that will, in the years ahead, become one of the most critical arteries of the Allied war effort, a network so well hidden that enemy intelligence never fully grasped its existence, let alone its scale. Deep beneath the Surrey hills, a locomotive is moving through the dark. It carries no passengers. It is marked with no identifying insignia. Its timetable exists in no public record. The driver knows the route by memory, not because he has studied it, but because he has driven it hundreds of times in absolute blackout conditions, guided only by the feel of the rails beneath him and the faint glow of signal lights set so low as to be invisible from the surface. The cargo behind him is classified. The destination is classified. The very existence of the tunnel through which he is passing is, officially, classified. This is the War Department Light Railway, or rather, one small part of it. Because what the British had built, quietly, methodically, with the peculiar organizational genius that war tends to unlock, was a subterranean supply network of extraordinary ambition, secret tunnels, hidden depots, concealed sidings, and underground arsenals threading beneath some of the most strategically sensitive terrain in the country. A railway that moved ammunition, fuel, food, equipment, and men, all without a single locomotive appearing on a German reconnaissance photograph. It is a story that has never received the attention it deserves, not because the records were destroyed, many survive, but because secrecy was so thoroughly enforced during the war that the habit of silence outlasted the conflict itself. Whole communities lived above these tunnels for decades without knowing they were there. Signalmen worked in surface stations feet away from concealed branch lines they were never told about. The men and women who built and operated the network signed the Official Secrets Act and, by and large, kept their word for the rest of their lives. But the infrastructure remains, and the records, where they have been declassified, reveal something remarkable, a feat of wartime engineering that protected Britain's most vulnerable supply chains from the one thing the Luftwaffe could always find: anything visible from above. To understand why the British built their secret railway, you have to understand the particular terror of early wartime bombing doctrine. When war came in September 1939, the prevailing military assumption on both sides was that aerial bombardment would be decisive, rapid, and catastrophic. Analysts at the Air Ministry had war-gamed scenarios in which German bombers, operating without serious opposition, could flatten British cities within weeks. The phrase used in internal memoranda was the knockout blow, a single sustained aerial campaign that would paralyze the country before any meaningful resistance could be organized. What the pre-war planners had not fully accounted for was infrastructure, not factories, not airfields, not ports, though all of these were obvious targets, but the web of roads, rail lines, marshalling yards, and storage depots that connected them. By 1940, German bombing strategy had evolved to target precisely these connections. A factory producing Spitfires was useless if the railway line carrying raw materials to it had been cratered. An artillery battery defending the coast was helpless if the road bringing its ammunition had been cut. The British Army's experience in France had made this vulnerability brutally clear. During the chaotic retreat to Dunkirk in May and June of 1940, German aircraft had systematically hunted road and rail movement by daylight. Lorry convoys were strafed. Railway junctions were bombed repeatedly. Supply columns backed up for miles, unable to disperse, unable to conceal themselves. Equipment was abandoned not because it was destroyed, but because the routes to move it had collapsed. The Army came home from Dunkirk having lost not merely men and materiel, but its faith in the reliability of surface transport under hostile skies. The question facing the War Office in the summer of 1940 was stark and urgent. How do you move the enormous quantities of materiel required to defend and eventually counterattack when the enemy controls the sky during daylight hours and can find anything that moves on a road or railway line? Night movement helped, but it was not a complete solution. German night bombing was improving, and certain supplies, ammunition being the most sensitive, could not simply be dispersed across open countryside. They required dedicated, protected storage, close enough to operational units to be useful, but far enough from surface observation to survive a concentrated bombing campaign. The answer, when it came, was one that Britain had more reason than most nations to consider. The country's Victorian engineers had left it an extraordinary geological inheritance. Hundreds of miles of disused rail tunnels, chalk mine workings, natural cave systems, and purpose-dug railway cuttings that could, with modification, serve as underground storage and transit facilities. Some of these had already been earmarked by civil defense planners for use as air raid shelters. The War Office saw something more ambitious. The facility that best illustrates what the British achieved lies beneath the Wiltshire countryside, roughly 3 kilometers northeast of the town of Corsham. It had begun its life as a stone quarry, worked since the 17th century for the distinctive bathylitic limestone that built much of the West Country's architecture. By the 1930s, the quarry had been largely exhausted, but the tunnels it had left behind extended for miles beneath the surface, with headroom of up to 6 meters, nearly 20 feet, and passage widths sufficient to accommodate a standard-gauge railway track. The War Office had been quietly assessing the site since 1936. By the time war began in earnest, construction teams from the Royal Engineers were already underground. What they built over the following 3 years was staggering in scale. The facility, known officially as Central Ammunition Depot Corsham, and in internal War Office documents simply as CAD Corsham, would eventually encompass approximately 3.5 million square feet, roughly 325,000 square meters, of underground storage space, making it one of the largest subterranean facilities ever constructed in Britain. Tunnels were widened, floors were leveled, rail tracks were laid. Ventilation shafts were sunk to maintain airflow but designed with baffles and blast doors to prevent a surface explosion from propagating below ground. Electric lighting was installed throughout, a significant engineering challenge in itself, requiring its own generating capacity and distribution network. The ammunition stored at CAD Corsham was delivered and dispatched by rail. Standard gauge tracks connected the facility to the mainline railway network via carefully disguised surface junctions. Sidings that, from the air, appeared to be unremarkable goods yards attached to existing stations. Underground, these lines divided and subdivided into a branching network that allowed multiple trains to load and unload simultaneously across different sections of the depot. The locomotives used underground were specially adapted, electric traction motors replacing steam, to avoid the lethal problem of carbon monoxide accumulation in enclosed spaces. At its wartime peak, CAD Corsham employed over 2,000 people, working in shifts around the clock. The overwhelming majority of them had no idea of the facility's total extent. Workers in the northern tunnels had never visited the southern sections. Administrative staff processed manifests for shipments without knowing the final destination of the goods being dispatched. This compartmentalization was not merely bureaucratic tidiness, it was deliberate security policy. No single person who might be captured, turned, or simply indiscreet should hold the complete picture in their head. Corsham was not unique. Across the country, similar facilities were being developed with varying degrees of ambition and secrecy. Ridge Quarry, a few miles to the southwest of Corsham, served as an underground aircraft component store. Monkton Farley, also in the Wiltshire complex, held small arms ammunition and explosives. Brown's Quarry and Eastleigh's added further capacity. Taken together, the Corsham area alone represented an underground footprint that dwarfed most surface military facilities, and was completely invisible from the air. If you are finding this interesting, a subscribe helps more than you know. It lets this kind of overlooked history reach a wider audience. The operational history of these facilities is, in places, frustratingly difficult to piece together. Many records remain classified longer than might be expected, not because their content is sensitive by modern standards, but because the institutional habit of secrecy, once established, proved extraordinarily durable. What can be reconstructed from declassified War Office records, engineering surveys, and the accounts of workers who eventually broke their silence tells a story of quiet, unglamorous, entirely essential efficiency. During the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, when German bombers attacked British cities on 57 consecutive nights and continued raids for months thereafter, the underground ammunition depots continued to operate without interruption. Surface rail lines were damaged repeatedly. Junctions were bombed. Marshalling yards were cratered. Rolling stock was destroyed. But the underground network, by its nature, was immune to all of this. When a surface junction was hit, trains were rerouted through alternative connections. When daylight movement became too dangerous, the underground sections operated continuously through the night, their concealed surface exits disguised by camouflage nets and false vegetation. The psychological dimension of this resilience is important and sometimes overlooked. The British Army's ability to sustain operations through the worst of the Blitz was not simply a function of production capacity. It was a function of storage and distribution. Weapons and ammunition that cannot be reliably delivered to the units that need them might as well not exist. The underground network meant that even in the darkest periods of the bombing campaign, unit commanders in southern England could requisition ammunition and receive it. That certainty, that the supply chain would hold, was worth an immeasurable amount in terms of operational confidence and fighting will. The Luftwaffe, for their part, appear to have remained almost entirely unaware of the full extent of what lay beneath the Wiltshire countryside. German intelligence assessments of British ammunition storage, declassified after the war, consistently underestimated British reserve capacity. Part of this was a failure of human intelligence. Britain's counter-espionage work during the war was remarkably effective, and the double-cross system ensured that most German agents operating in Britain were either captured or turned. But part of it was simply that there was nothing to see. Reconnaissance aircraft flying over Corsham photographed what appeared to be quiet agricultural land, a small market town, unremarkable goods yards. The scale of what lay beneath generated no surface signature that could be detected from 6,000 meters. The German approach to underground military storage was, by comparison, considerably less sophisticated and considerably more brutal. The Third Reich built underground facilities, certainly. The V-weapon production facilities at Mittelwerk in the Harz Mountains are the most notorious example, constructed using concentration camp labor at a cost in human suffering that remains almost incomprehensible. But German underground construction was primarily driven by the need to protect production facilities from Allied bombing. It was reactive, and it was costly. The British approach had been proactive, exploiting existing geology rather than excavating from scratch, and it had been planned before the bombing campaigns that necessitated it. The Americans, entering the war in 1941 and establishing vast supply depots across the British Isles in preparation for the eventual invasion of Europe, were initially astonished by the scale of the existing underground network. American logistics planners had developed their own doctrine of dispersal, spreading supplies across many small depots rather than concentrating them. But the British underground system offered something dispersal alone could not: genuine imperviousness to air attack. American engineers studied the Corsham complex closely and took its lessons back with them. The influence of British wartime underground storage can be traced in American Cold War civil defense architecture, in the hardened command facilities built during the 1950s and 1960s, and in the fundamental principle, obvious now, revolutionary then, that the safest place to store anything vital is underground. The Soviets, too, took note. Intelligence assessments compiled by British officers after the war suggest that Soviet military planners drew on captured German reports about British supply resilience, which themselves pointed to underground storage as a key factor. The tunnel and bunker building programs that characterized Soviet military infrastructure throughout the Cold War have complex origins, but the lesson of British wartime experience, that a supply network the enemy cannot see is a supply network the enemy cannot destroy, runs through all of them. Assessing the true strategic impact of Britain's secret railway and its associated underground network is difficult, because the nature of the thing makes counterfactual argument almost irresistible. What would have happened if the Luftwaffe had found and destroyed these facilities? The honest answer is that we do not know. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that the facilities handled an enormous volume of materiel throughout the war. Estimates for CAD Corsham alone suggest tens of millions of ammunition rounds passing through the system, and that they did so without a single successful enemy attack. What is less uncertain is the legacy. The infrastructure built in such secrecy between 1936 and 1944 did not simply disappear at the war's end. CAD Corsham continued in military use for decades. Parts of the underground network were repurposed during the Cold War. Some tunnels became regional government headquarters, designed to function as command centers in the event of nuclear attack. The Burlington Bunker, a vast underground facility near Corsham intended to house the British government during a nuclear war, is in many respects a direct descendant of the wartime ammunition depot, exploiting the same geology, using some of the same engineering principles, maintaining the same tradition of extraordinary secrecy about what lay beneath apparently normal English countryside. The surface today gives little away. The Wiltshire fields above the old tunnels look much as they did in 1943, green and unremarkable, grazed by sheep, threaded by footpaths. Some of the ventilation shafts survive, disguised as agricultural outbuildings or simply overgrown. A few of the tunnel entrances are visible to those who know where to look, sealed with blast doors that are themselves now listed structures. The Corsham Computer Center occupies part of the old underground complex, a commercial data center, storing the digital records of the present in tunnels built to store the physical material of the past. English heritage and various military history groups have worked to document surviving sections of the network, and limited tours of some areas are now occasionally available. The Imperial War Museum holds records relating to the construction and operation of the wartime depots. The Wiltshire and Swindon History Center has engineering surveys that, studied carefully, begin to suggest the true scale of what was built. Return, then, to the autumn of 1940, to the locomotive moving through the dark beneath the Surrey hills, to a driver who knows this tunnel better than he knows his own street, navigating in near-total blackness by feel and memory and the accumulated instinct of hundreds of identical runs. Above him, Britain is being bombed. Fires are visible for miles on clear nights. Railways are being cut, roads cratered, marshalling yards reduced to twisted steel and smoking rubble. The newspapers carry photographs of devastation that, even with wartime censorship, suggest an onslaught of appalling intensity. The question being asked in every home, every government office, every mess room is the same. Can we hold? Can the supply lines hold? And they did hold. Not because the bombing was less severe than feared. In places it was worse. Not because production was unaffected. Factories were hit, workers killed, output disrupted. They held in significant part because the most critical supplies were being moved and stored somewhere that German bombers, German reconnaissance aircraft, and German intelligence could not find. Beneath the ground, on railways that appeared on no published map, in tunnels that had been quarried by Victorian stonecutters and repurposed by quietly brilliant military planners who had seen the danger coming and prepared for it years before the first bomb fell. The secret railway is not the whole story of British wartime resilience. It is not even the most famous chapter. But it is, perhaps, one of the most instructive. Because what it represents is not heroism in any conventional sense. There are no famous battles fought in these tunnels, no names that schoolchildren learn. What it represents is something more prosaic and more durable. The value of thinking ahead, of building what you need before the crisis demands it, of protecting what matters by making it invisible. Germany had its underground facilities. Germany had its engineers, its concrete, its industrial capacity. What Germany did not have was a tunnel beneath the Wiltshire countryside that had been quietly, patiently, thoroughly prepared for exactly this war, in exactly this way, years before the war began. The locomotive moves through the dark. The cargo is delivered. The guns are loaded. And somewhere above in the cold autumn sky, a German reconnaissance aircraft photographs green English fields, sees nothing of significance, and turns for home. The secret held. And because it held, so did everything else.